We really are going to call the meeting back to order and proceed with item 8.4, which is a public hearing on our accessory dwelling unit zoning text amendment. Eric Gage is staff.
Good afternoon, Chair Cisco and members of the Planning Commission. The item before you is the accessory dwelling unit zoning code amendment, text amendment. So I'll begin with the definition of the accessory dwelling unit. It is defined as an independent dwelling unit on a property containing a single-family residence, including complete living facilities, which are defined as sleeping quarters, bathing facilities, and kitchen. They may be detached, freestanding structures. They may be attached to the primary residence or other existing structure, or may be an internal conversion of a portion of a residence. So as background, the Santa Rosa Housing Action Plan was accepted by City Council in fall of 2016. It was a program that included several steps to enhance housing supply. It included measures to remove barriers for accessory dwelling construction and emphasized affordability by design, emphasizing smaller, more affordable units such as accessory dwellings. Also recommending removal of the owner-occupancy deed restriction for accessory dwellings, and recommended staff evaluate revisions to the parking requirements. Also in the fall of 2016, Governor Brown signed bills into law that streamlined some of the and eliminated some requirements for accessory dwelling units. These superseded local ordinances that were not consistent with the requirements. And when the law went into effect on January 1st of this year, the city's accessory dwelling ordinance was superseded by those requirements. A separate bill also signed by Governor Brown at the same time created an optional subcategory of accessory dwellings that was referred to as a junior accessory dwelling, and established a set of standards and streamlining benefits to those units as well. So I will go through some proposed code revisions and attempt to distinguish them clearly from the revisions that were required by the state ordinance. Beginning with the removal of the owner-occupancy deed restriction, as mentioned before, that is proposed to be removed. Modifying square footage requirements and bedroom limitations. The prior city ordinance limited the square footage of units to be 700 square feet and limited them to a single bedroom. We're proposing aligning the city ordinance with the state provision to have a maximum limit of 1,200 square feet for a new or existing detached accessory structure, and for an attached or internal conversion, that habitable space be no greater than 50% of the existing habitable space, or a maximum limit of 1,200. And I also want to note a correction to the staff report that it should specify 50% for new attached accessory dwellings. Also proposed to be removed is the stated requirement for a permanent foundation, which existed in the prior version of the city's ordinance. It's considered to be redundant to requirements under the building code, so we're proposing removal of that. Require that the residential duration, the rental duration be no less than 30 days for an accessory dwelling. And with the removal of the owner occupancy requirement at City Council's direction, this was seen as a mechanism to prevent both units from becoming short-term rentals. Also, provisions for the development of the accessory dwelling. We're proposing incorporating those into the city ordinance without change as written by the state. And lastly, new standards for hillside and historic areas. The State regulation prohibits local jurisdictions from requiring a discretionary process to approve accessory dwellings. So we attempted to craft ministerial standards that may be applied for hillside and historic areas, and we did that with some consultation with the Cultural Heritage Board, which I will get to in a moment. I'm going to get more into detail as to the specifics, changes that are proposed, and once again try to distinguish which are the state requirements and which ones are ones that that the city is proposing to add. Newly constructed accessory dwellings currently required one off-street parking space and will continue to require an off-street parking space in addition to the parking requirement for the single-family dwelling, with a number of exceptions. So the state mandate included multiple provisions for being exempt from that parking requirement if it is within half a mile of a bus, train, or other form of mass transit stop, if it's within a historic preservation district, or within 1 block of a car share vehicle, that parking requirement for a single space would be waived. In addition, the state mandate is to not require a parking space for any internal conversion of existing residential space or existing accessory structure. So regarding setbacks, the state mandate was specific to setback requirements for conversions of existing structures. And the final bullet here, no setback would be required for an existing structure such as a garage, structures built as second-story additions to an existing garage would be subject to a 5-foot setback from rear and side property lines. But in addition to that, the city is proposing to relax the setback requirements. Previously, they were subject to setback requirements, same as the primary dwelling. And for single-story units, the proposal is that they be subject to the accessory structure setbacks, which are more relaxed. However, for new additions to a primary residence or for a 2-story freestanding structure, they would be subject to the primary dwelling setbacks as before. Some other requirements, and these are state mandated requirements. The newly constructed accessory dwellings such as freestanding or an attached addition would pay demand fees and metering for water and wastewater. The state provision includes a waiver for conversion of existing living spaces and accessory structures. They would not pay demand fees or require a metering. I should also comment that fees were a subject of great focus, and that they are not necessarily the focus of this action. The language pertaining to fees is included in the city's fee schedule, not in the zoning code, but that there are ongoing parallel efforts to evaluate fees, find opportunities to reduce those fees, and incentivize the construction of accessory dwellings and small, affordable by design units. And on the topic of junior accessory dwellings, these were fairly specifically defined by the state regulation, and those are outlined here. They're all requirements, and the city's ability to alter these is limited. So the junior accessory dwelling is defined as an interior conversion of a single-family residence. The maximum square footage allowed is 500 square feet. It is required to have access through to the primary residence and also to the exterior of the building. The owner-occupancy deed restriction is required in this case, and limited kitchen facilities are also required. It requires the conversion of existing bedroom, and what isn't noted here and should be mentioned is that it allows for the unit to utilize the primary residence's bathroom, meaning that it's required to convert an existing bedroom, but it's not required to contain its own bathroom. And finally, the exemptions would apply automatically, the exemption to waive utility fees and parking requirements. Outlining the city's public process, the city's regulations, as mentioned before, were superseded on the first of the year, and an interim guidance on how to interpret the state law was issued at that time and published on the website. Planning director conducted a number of informational interviews with media. There was email outreach to the community advisory board and a number of other housing groups, nonprofits, developers, other interested parties. A community meeting was held on February 8th, and the discussion draft of the proposed revisions was presented at that meeting. And a city council hearing is targeted for August. I should also mention that, as mentioned before, the Cultural Heritage Board was consulted on the ministerial standards for accessory dwelling development in historic neighborhoods. So quickly summarizing community comments, we got about 20 written comments, more or less, and the subject of fees was by far the most commented concern, that permit fees, impact fees were cost prohibitive for projects. Similarly, the requirement for a separate water connection and water fees was considered an obstacle. There was a mixed response to the removal of the owner-occupancy deed restriction, but there were more comments that felt that it would have negative impacts to a neighborhood than there were comments that it was a beneficial feature. And regarding the subject of vacation rentals, there was concern that supplemental income that was generated by homeowners by short-term rentals would be lost. Regarding CEQA, the code revision benefits from a statutory exemption, which is a blanket exemption in the CEQA guidelines saying that project is exempt for implementing the accessory dwelling ordinance in the state law. And now I'm going to walk through the feedback we received from Cultural Heritage Board and some other proposed revisions to the ordinance language tonight. And the first one being was the change of this terminology, the change of consistency to compatibility. And that was the preference of the board. Staff, in consultation with City Attorney's Office, prefers the option of consistency, retaining the language that's in there now, simply with the overarching goal of achieving a less interpretive, more ministerial terminology. Some other terms that were recommended replacement, and staff supports these changes, changing the phrase report to historic resource survey, which is a very specific term under CEQA for analysis of historic impacts. Also changing architectural historian to a more broad term that would encompass more circumstances, potential circumstances, is to change it from architectural historian to a qualified professional. And lastly, to update the reference to the rehabilitation and the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation and guidelines for rehabilitating historic buildings to the current version of those guidelines, which is named the Standards for Treatment of Historic Properties. And the last recommendation made by Cultural Heritage Board was an additional requirement for conceptual Cultural Heritage Board review prior to building permit issuance for projects that were within a preservation district. And staff is not recommending this direction, primarily because in consultation with city attorney's staff, it's deemed potentially in conflict with the intent and wording of the state law. An additional revision to the ordinance language is the language for the internal conversion, which upon subsequent reading and comment by the public was a bit confused in its phrasing. So proposing the strikeout as shown here, rather than using the term building, it would be residence, and adding some language at the end to refer specifically to accessory structures. And that concludes staff's presentation with the recommendation of the Planning Commission to recommend to City Council approval of the ordinance amendments, the various zoning code sections listed, to allow for the revision of the accessory dwelling unit and the amendment of the code with the junior accessory dwelling unit language. And that concludes my presentation.
Okay. Commissioner, I'm sure we all have a lot of questions, but I'm going to ask that we hold them for now until after the public hearing so we can get the public's comments and start collecting maybe additional things for our questions. Okay, so this is a public hearing tonight, and I have 5 cards on it. I'll go ahead and call your name, come up to the microphone, and you've heard the rules a couple times now. You've been here a while, so... First, it looks like Steve Worth, followed by Lisa Landers.
Good afternoon. My name is Steve Watts. I've lived in Santa Rosa since that's okay, no big thing, since the mid-'70s. And I bought my first house and it had a mother-in-law unit in it. I still own that house. I think this is a great project for Santa Rosa because we do have a problem with low-income housing. We live in a community that's 600,000 medium price plus. I think that you're missing part of what's going on in the city of Santa Rosa, though. We have about 2,000 to 3,000 illegal units currently in the city of Santa Rosa. ADUs and junior ADUs. I happen to have one of those. I have a horse in the race. So I'd like to see if we could come to some kind of resolution long term that these people could bring these into compliance and make them legal for the city of Santa Rosa. And if you want to know where they are, just drive around the junior college, drive around Montgomery Village, Mayette Village, Bennett Valley, Rincon Valley, any of those places, and you'll see them all over the place. Garages are taken out, they're converted. I have one that was converted before I bought it. It was my first house. I would have never been able to get into a house unless I was able to get this unit. I lived in the back unit for 7 years. I lived in the house for 17 years. Since then, I've been very successful and owned many homes in the area, also developed radio stations in this area, and have given a lot back to the community. And it's a great opportunity for these units to get assessed and brought kind of into the fold. The other thing is, as has been brought up, the costs with doing ADUs is prohibitive. I've spoken to John Sawyer, I've spoken to Mr. Tibbetts, I had a phone conversation with Mr. Corsi, and everybody's pretty much in agreement that they have a $7,000 park fee. The fees for building an ADU in this community are somewhere between $15,000 and $25,000. No one that has an ADU currently is going to come in and say, hey, charge me $25,000, maybe I'll get it legal. And people that are building them, as I've talked to many people, not only here but other places, there's no reason to put one in if it's going to cost $25,000. You're not going to recoup your investment, and for a lot of people it is an investment. I did it. My unit was one that I used. I'm now using it for my mentally challenged uncle who has dementia now, and my family's asked me to take care of him. So it's a way for that, but it's also a way for junior college students and so on and so forth to get an opportunity to get into the market and get started and having a reasonable place to live. And that's all I have to say, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you. So next is Lisa Landers, followed by Debbie McKay.
Hello, Lisa Landris, Lifetime here. I have a legal granny unit that is part of my home, but it also has a shared doorway, so it could qualify if I made the changes and things, but I'm happy using it the way it is. I'm so happy to see the conversation moving in this direction, because this frees up so much inventory. I have so many friends that want to build these at their house. And when we went to that meeting and they said how much money for a water meter, how much water for, or how much fee for schools and all this, at some point it was up to about $45,000. And then we were ushered with the statement, and we really hope you'll keep the rents low and do affordable housing. Well, how can you do that if the city doesn't come to the bargaining table with us and offer some diminished fees for that? So these are units that would never get built otherwise because it's strictly cost prohibitive. There's nobody who's going to go and do this, especially not at affordable housing levels. It's just not going to be done. My whole background is in rentals. My family's been here forever. We got in and through partnerships that came in through HUD, where we supplied low-income housing as a trade in a contract where we got a good deal on our interest rates. We were able to rehab a bunch of defunct properties in southwest Santa Rosa area and provided great housing to a lot of people for many years, and that could have never happened. But the civic part has to come and join in. You have to do that and not put it all on the community. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you. Debbie McKay, and she'll be followed by Meg McNeese.
I'm also a long-term resident of Santa Rosa, over 30 years, and I would encourage you to make one modification under it's 20.42.130D3A, and that has to do with utility connection fees. And I also attended the meeting in February and heard a lot of concern about the requirement of having a separate water meter. I understand why the city is interested in doing that to try to encourage people to conserve water, but I would suggest that you add in there, allow for an owner to have an option of installing a separate utility connection rather than making it an absolute requirement. And that way the owner could decide if that was the best option for the additional water meter or whether they wanted to use the existing water meter. That would be one way to hold down costs. My other comment is all of the cities in Sonoma County are having to look at this issue, and the city of Petaluma has set the fees at only 25% of the fees for a regular I guess primary unit you'd call it. So for their additional units, they're only charging 25% of the normal fees. So there has to be a way to deal with these other fees, and I think it would be worthwhile you as a body recommending to the city council that they look at what other cities are doing to reduce these fees, because I think the city of Sebastopol is exploring a similar method of holding those fees down, because we do need the housing, as everyone knows, and the only way it's going to be affordable is if people are not facing the kind of fees that are proposed. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Meg McNeese, followed by Rachel, looks like Guinness.
I would agree with everything that's been said prior to me speaking. I've been here 30 years. I have a small house in Montgomery Village. I'm trying to figure out how to stretch my dollars so that I can die in my house. And I would like to be able to have a unit added so that I can have nursing if I need it, or extra income. I disagree with the presentation in reducing the number of days for a rental. I really need to be able to have short-term rental, and I think that should be part of the regulation as long as it's owner-occupied. That's the difference to me. I recently was in Denver. I rented a house. Denver City Council just changed their rules that you cannot rent out the house unless you have an owner-occupied to keep a control on what happens for your Airbnb, and I agree with that completely. We need an amnesty to bring back people for all these units that are out there. There's 3,000 units. I think there's only 600 that are permitted. We need to change that. I appreciate your time, and I appreciate the time of the Planning Committee. I look forward to more input. I think they set that meeting in February for 50 people, and 200 people showed up. So there's a strong interest, and let's go for it.
Thank you. Next is Rachel Guinness, and followed by Peter Hendrickson.
Good evening. I'm Rachel Guinness. I'm the Executive Director of Lily Pad Homes. We were the sponsor of the bill at the state level and have been passing local code in Marin around junior accessory dwelling units. First of all, it's just wonderful. I now live in Kenwood, and it's wonderful to see this coming to Sonoma. I wanted to encourage you to consider allowing for a junior accessory dwelling unit and an accessory dwelling unit on the same property. That's happened in 3 communities now: unincorporated Sonoma, Richmond, and unincorporated Marin. They're used differently, as you've heard people say. A junior unit is really a flexible in-law apartment used to house often loved ones, caregivers, or people in your family or people you know in the community, while taking advantage of the opportunity to create a complete independent living space, an ADU, on your property as well for income. So because of the owner-occupancy requirement in junior units, it would, if somebody were to create an ADU and a junior unit on a property, you would know that the owner was in place in that situation, so people could not just maximize the income from additional units. I also wanted to point out that because junior units use existing bedrooms, they don't represent any increase in occupancy of the home. So while park fees or other fees might be, appropriately applicable to other types of ADUs, it's really kind of double taxation. You've already paid the park fees and everything for the rooms that you have in your home. And I also wanted to point out that the parking requirement for a junior unit, although there is no new parking required, if there, and I didn't have clarity on this myself, if the parking was allowed in any configuration on the property, because it would actually be the ADUs would have more license to have parking on properties in any configuration than junior units would, and that doesn't necessarily make sense. In other words, if a house doesn't necessarily meet the current legal parking standard, if those parking spaces could be created in any configuration, you would have the right to utilize the bedrooms in your home as your family and your needs saw fit. And that's pretty much it for me. Thank you again for looking at this issue. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. And next is Peter Hendrickson.
Thank you. I'm just going to reiterate what a couple other folks have already talked about, and it was a concern of mine when we went to the first public meeting, and that has to do with, and as I understand it, this is a zoning code change which would not dictate utility fees. That would be in the jurisdiction of the building department, if I'm not mistaken. So my concern then would be, what I have to say is this ordinance was followed pretty well what the state recommended in their code change, and I'm really pleased to see that. But they do mention in here that a connection subject to a connection fee or capacity charge that shall be proportionate to the burden of the proposed accessory dwelling unit, based upon either its size or the number of its plumbing fixtures or upon water and sewer system. The fee or charge shall not exceed the reasonable cost of providing the service. So there's no way that's controlled by the zoning ordinance. It's just a suggestion, as I understand it. So I would really be concerned about what the intention is to modify any of the fees based on this the spirit of this code from the state code. So anyway, that's a consideration that maybe there's no answer for at the moment, but I'd like to see that addressed. Thank you.
Thank you. That's all the cards I have. Anyone else wishing to speak? Come on down. And again, if you begin by stating your name for the record.
Yes. Good evening. My name is Sharon Doherty. I've lived in Santa Rosa since 1978. I'm still in the family home. I live by myself. I'm pretty healthy, but I'm also 75 years old. What I'm hoping to accomplish, if it's possible, is to have an ADU unit put in my yard or attached to my home. I don't know how it would go. I have no idea what I'm doing here. But the idea is I want to be able to have my daughter and son-in-law occupy either one or the other. And I'd probably occupy the smaller unit. They'd probably occupy the house. So that if, in the future, if I need some help, or if I'm not feeling really well or whatever, this would be the time to prepare for something like that. And for me, I do have limited funds. So what I'd like to be able to do is to do it effectively, efficiently, with a dollar value that's going to help me get to what my goal is. I appreciate, and I would like to say that February meeting was quite wonderful. I would like to publicly thank Eric Gage and Bill Rose and the advisory panel that was there that night. There were so many people that we changed rooms twice. We wound up in the senior center in the large banquet room. I think, honestly, I could speak for the elderly folks that were there, and there were quite a few of them, actually, that have the same concerns that I have. And so, really, I'm just hoping you guys will help us to make this happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else wishing to speak tonight on this item? Okay, I'm not seeing anyone else come down, so I'm going to go ahead and close the public hearing and have staff come back initially before we begin our questions. And so, why don't we start with fees? That'll take care of a number of things. Can you tell us the plan for the fee discussion?
So as mentioned before, there are ongoing efforts parallel to this zoning code revision to address impact fees for accessory units and find ways to incentivize the affordable by design smaller units and to reduce the fee burden overall. I think I might invite any member of our executive staff here to elaborate on that procedural process as it continues.
So fees were by far the number one comment, and I think every speaker tonight echoed that. Every speaker that wants to talk about second dwelling units talks about the primary obstacle being fees. So all along, concurrent with the zoning changes, looking at the mandates by the state, but also taking it further in compliance with our housing action plan. Staff's quite aware, and not just planning staff, but it's an interdepartmental effort, is to look at how we address fees. So we do have a larger program effort that's looking at impact fees for across the city, not just second dwelling units, but while this is going through its process, this is the opportunity to sort of look at second dwelling unit fees in particular. So we are intending that as a companion piece to this zoning proposal, if it moves forward tonight by the Planning Commission, that when we get to City Council, we will be able to have something there for their consideration to address fees for second dwelling units. Now, we don't know what they will do, but what we'll do is we'll provide them information and options to consider in terms of addressing fee reductions for second units. So I don't know if the speakers tonight accessed our staff report, but the staff report for the item tonight does actually go into us in depth of a summary of the strategy that we're looking at. And so, for example, just looking at scenarios throughout the city, different quadrants have different fee scenarios. We're looking at internal conversions having a fee total of about $5,000, which is in compliance with state law, but also looking at other opportunities for fees that the city controls, park fees, CFF. We don't control school fees, so I think that's $3,000 of that $5,000. So there are some fees that we're not going to be able to touch. But looking deeper, and as Eric has mentioned, looking at affordable by design and figuring out what is that threshold of affordable by design. Our research looks like it's somewhere around 700 square feet where we can still count it as moderate income. And giving those units a break. So just by size, giving them a break on fees to make it, to incentivize smaller units for housing. Also affordable by contract, though probably not as popular as affordable by design, but providing that incentive. And the affordable by contract we're exploring whether it's 700 square feet or up to the maximum of 1,200 square feet, but that concession of having it affordable by contract. So those are the types of things we're exploring. That's obviously not before the Planning Commission tonight, but it's the elephant in the room, if you will, for second dwelling units. And so we are quite aware, and we're developing the data that will be necessary for the council to make their determinations and options.
Okay. And then what are our plans, if any, to deal with existing illegal units?
The zoning code revision proposed doesn't include a discussion about an amnesty program, and I think that will probably be part of the ongoing discussion about fee reductions and waivers. I don't know if anyone wants to comment further.
So again, an amnesty program would be something above and beyond, but perhaps concurrent with this zoning proposal. So this type of proposal is not before you for an amnesty program. What we are trying to do is structurally incentivize legalizing their units. So one of the things that we learned since February, which is why it's taken us some time to craft this particular ordinance, is the setback requirements for the second unit in the backyard. A lot of those illegal units are within that the primary setback. So a lot of single family dwellings, for example, have a 15-foot rear yard setback. And so how do you legalize that if it's already there? Well, one of the ways that would help legalize some of these existing units is by allowing that setback to reduce back to 5 feet like any other accessory structure. So we tried to address some of the legality issues for existing units structurally in this ordinance. And then I think fees will also be an incentive. And also just general openness all along, trying to push this to really open it up so that this speaks to developers who are coming forward with subdivisions, trying to attract their interest in building second units. So it's a combination of setbacks, the deed restriction, the fees that we were looking at, and then also just your single homeowner opportunities, trying to build in the flexibilities that they need to make it happen, to legalize their units. So it's built in, and we have an open counter. We work with anybody who will work with us, and we always seek to be successful for them. We want the housing, so we have an in practice amnesty program in that our doors are always open for them.
Okay. One of the members of the public was asking about separate water meters, allowing the option to the owner. And I know we do have the discussion about the utility fees that where the second meter is not required. Would you go over that and answer that person's
I'll recap
concern?
the discussion of the state regulation and the mandates involved. There's also staff from Water Department that can elaborate on those requirements. The state regulation states that for conversions of existing residential space or for conversions of existing accessory structures such as a garage, those units would not be subject to the requirement for a separate water and wastewater connection or impact fees relating to those utilities. Right now, as it's written, the ordinance revision states that new developments, such as a new freestanding accessory structure or in addition to an existing residence, would require the unit to assess those fees and provide a separate connection. But I'll invite staff from Water to elaborate on the specific requirements.
Good evening, Karen Lozada, Santa Rosa Water. Eric's correct. For an existing unit that are converting, we do not allow we don't require the separate meter. The state doesn't allow us to do that. Prior to the state law, we did require it. We are no longer requiring it. We suggest it for water conservation, but we don't require it. The new unit, however, would be required to install a separate meter. The junior accessory units are not required in either case, whether it's new or converted from existing. They do not require a separate meter.
Okay, great, thank you. And then I think this is an interesting question too. The comment that Ms. Guinness made about allowing both a junior dwelling unit as well as a second accessory dwelling unit, when our definition is just saying one. Could you talk about that?
Sure. I can clarify that point. The wording of the code isn't explicit. It doesn't say you can have both, but the wording of the code right now is you may have one accessory dwelling, you may have one junior accessory dwelling, and based on the city attorney's assessment of the state regulation, we're interpreting that to mean that you may have one of each, but not more than one of each, for a total of up to 3 units on an individual parcel.
Okay, good to know. Okay. And then she was also asking about the parking requirement for the JDU in whatever configuration.
Okay. So to clarify that area, remembering that the state regulation identified a number of exemptions for the parking requirement of a single space for an accessory dwelling, and it identified multiple exemptions, one being that the unit be within half a mile of a transit stop, I think it was 2 blocks from a car share, or lastly that it be in a historic district. The internal conversions and the junior accessory dwelling, inclusive of those, are exempt from parking requirement. But I think what was being referred to is potentially the conversion of an existing garage and the loss of an existing space. And the state regulation is explicit that if parking is lost from the demolition or conversion of a garage, the parking required may be configured in any way necessary on the lot. And that's what I alluded to earlier, that it may be in tandem or in setbacks. It is not subject to a covered parking space requirement. And there's also the provision for street parking to serve the single-family residence. So there's a certain amount of flexibility in the way parking is configured when a garage is converted, for example.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think that was all of the questions. We did have the comment disagreeing with the minimum 30-day rental, and that's something that we can discuss up here, but that wasn't really a question. So, all right, commissioners, now is our chance. Questions for staff? Commissioner Duggan.
Yeah, I've got one. I live in the junior college neighborhood, and there are a lot of, I think, long-time legal non-conforming units that are separate units, like detached garages, that don't meet the setback requirements. Mm-hmm. So would you have to change that? Like, I've got a garage personally that is within 3 feet of the side property line. So if I wanted to turn that into an ADU, would that have to meet the side setback requirements?
So the state regulation was pretty explicitly exempted all existing conversions from setback requirements. So if you have a garage on a property line or an existing accessory structure that is within a given setback, it's legal non-conforming, that existing space could be converted without any relocation on the site, it is exempt from the setback requirement.
Mr. Romo, you have any questions?
I do. I appreciate the clarification on parking and conversion of a garage and how that might work. I was a little bit confused on that. I do have maybe some questions. I don't know if they're procedural or what. The first is related to fees, right? Because I hear that there's the ongoing fee study. I appreciate that. I'm really disinclined to support any fee that would be cost prohibitive to conversion or development of accessory dwelling units. And I feel like even the analysis of what could be there is cost prohibitive that I was reading. And I don't think I'm going out on a limb. I'm hearing that loud and clear from the public as well. So I'm hearing that we're not being asked to weigh in on the fees, that there's a separate process and the council is taking it up. I want to make sure that the council is hearing what I hope to be a pretty unanimous voice, that we don't want, as a planning commission, we don't want fees to be cost prohibitive as well, and what input we can provide. So that may be more of a procedural question than anything, and we'll stay out of trying to hash out what an appropriate fee is, respects the staff process. But I do want to make sure that it's very clear, at least from my perspective, even if we're talking about low thousands, that's probably too much for somebody who particularly is on a fixed income and is trying to make a quality of life choice or improvement. So I'll keep on going maybe, and we can come back to the answer of that. Another question is around VRBOs and this 30-day requirement. And I'm wondering, I apologize, if this is a stupid question. Does the city of Santa Rosa have an ordinance that governs vacation rentals currently? No. Okay. I don't think that a accessory dwelling unit ordinance is the right place to govern VRBOs. I just don't. From a policy perspective, I think if we're going to tackle the VRBO question, that ought to be done in a...
Mr. Romo, we're going to ask questions, and then you're going to get an opportunity to give all your comments later. So
there was a question in there about the VRBO ordinance. I guess a question related to that then, though, is so if I convert my garage, let's say, in anticipation of moving my mother down, who has Alzheimer's, and I'd like her to live with my family. That's not going to happen for another year. Am I precluded then from that interim period from renting out the property, or maybe she's coming down and I guess how hard and fast is that 30-day period? Is that I can never ever rent out the ADU for less than 30 days? Or is it sort of like a primary use? I'm just trying to work through that issue in a practical term. So my question is, maybe can you explain that?
So I'll reiterate the intent behind that, and it was something that was written into the state regulations saying providing local governments with that option, the specific option being to limit the rental period to a minimum of 30 days. And the reason it was included here is because maybe out of an abundance of caution to not create a situation by which we're removing the owner-occupancy deed restriction and also creating an accessory unit with no limitation on the rental of it, with the potential for creating a situation where both units would be limited to short-term rental instead of being available for permanent or long-term residential housing for workforce, etc.
All right. So it was really just to tackle the VRBO issue?
I think that was the intention of the state.
Okay.
If I may interrupt here,
The prohibition as it's written in the ordinance is a flat prohibition against rental for terms less than 30 days.
Okay.
So
even if it was intended to be for that use, sort of in the future, in that interim period, I couldn't.
No, you could not.
Okay.
The way it's written, if you rent it to someone and they happen to move out in less than 30 days, it's not prohibiting that person from moving, but you would not be able to rent through a short-term rental program.
Okay. Thank you. I'll hold my comments.
Yeah, believe me, I'm going to give you a lot of opportunity we'll have plenty of time for that. So, Vice Chair Edmondson, your questions?
Microphone. Thank you. This is a question I sent in by email a few days ago, and I have a question about a couple of different places in the draft where we talk about how it's not the intent of the ordinance to override lawful use restrictions as set forth in conditions, covenants, and restrictions. So a CC&R that would be recorded for and on certain properties, it's a private agreement. It's not a matter of city law to create CCRs or enforce CCRs. But if a developer or a subdivider or homeowners association or a neighborhood wanted to record CC&Rs that would completely stop the residents and the future residents for the rest of time from being able to build an accessory dwelling unit, is that something that this ordinance just wouldn't put a roadblock in front of, that will continue to be a practice that would be available to developers?
So the language that you're referring to, I'll just reiterate it. The statement is, it is not the intent of this ordinance to override lawful use restrictions as set forth in conditions, covenants, and restrictions. And that's language that is not new. It was in the ordinance prior. And probably to address unforeseeable conflicts as regulations change. I think the question that you're asking is whether an accessory dwelling unit could be prohibited by CC&Rs and whether that would be lawful, whether that be in conflict with the state law. And the direction, the guidance that we've been given from the city attorney's office is that it would continue to be legal for a CC&R to prohibit that, but I'll ask them to confirm that for me.
Yes, that's true, both under state law and under the draft ordinance. There would be nothing that would preclude a developer in a new project from prohibiting accessory dwelling units going forward.
Is it beyond the city's legal authority to stop those going forward or to override the ones that are currently recorded?
We would not be able to override ones that are currently recorded. I would have to research whether the city would have jurisdiction to prohibit that kind of provision in a CC&R. I don't know offhand. I don't believe that we have that authority, but again, I have not researched that particular issue.
Okay, thank you. And just a second question quickly. I appreciate all the commentary that's happened so far about the number of ADUs that are permissible and how that interacts with the JADUs, because I was confused about that too when I was reading it. And so if the interpretation is that the limit of one is just for accessory dwelling units and not for JADUs, I think there are other places in the ordinance where the terms aren't really so exclusive of one another, so it could lead to confusion. So I would appreciate maybe a sentence either in the JADU section or in the provision about the number of accessory dwelling units that clarifies that that's the proper interpretation of it. And to piggyback off that a little bit, the whole revision in language, these have always been called second dwelling units, but the state now calls them accessory dwelling units because they want people to understand that you don't just get to put one on your property. That was sort of what I thought the point of the change in language was. So if we have a property where you can meet the parking and the setbacks and everything else, why would it be in our interest to limit people to just one junior and one ADU, or 0 juniors and 1 ADU? Why is the limit we've chosen to remain sort of at 2? So
The limit we've chosen was based on interpretive state law, what it would require. So we interpreted the requirement of state law to allow one of each. Exceeding that, when approaching this, we were sort of balancing a lot of competing interests and the idea of a single-family residential zone and its associated neighborhood, character, quality of life impacts, et cetera. And that going beyond that requirement of basically allowing a single unit residential lot to have up to 3 units on it with their associated impacts, that was as far as we would take it as a proposal. But I think it's important to note that when we're approaching something like a multifamily residential project, for lack of a better word, a multi-residential project, those are still allowable in multi-family residential zones.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Commissioner Gronica, any questions? Commissioner Weeks, a question.
Yes, I also have a question on the 30-day. I personally think that's too short. But I know that's probably not the purview of this. And then a question on the staff report. Under fiscal impact, it says that negligible reduction in fee revenue from state mandated waiver of some impact fees. But in reading through the staff report and the ordinance, it seems like there's going to be some monitoring required on the units, and so I wondered if there'd been an analysis done on any of the financial impact on specific departments related to that.
No, the answer is no. There was an assessment of a department, for example, a code enforcement, the costs in terms of resources and staff time to enforce a prohibition like that. No.
Okay, I also have a question on the minimum 30-day rental. We have existing granny units, second dwelling units. There are individuals that are probably currently using them for vacation rentals. When we enact this ordinance or recommend that it's enacted and council enacts it, what is the impact to those pre-existing second dwelling units being used as Airbnb if there is a prohibition in this?
So staff did consult with management on that topic, and what's currently the benchmark, I would say, for existing uses that would be sort of grandfathered in, that have a vested right, I guess that's the phrasing, would be right now there would be a requirement for them to have a tax certificate and be paying a transit occupancy tax. In addition to that, ideally they would have a zoning clearance that would identify this use. And the management direction has been that if that particular element were retained, that it would be evaluated on a case-by-case basis to see if the tax certificate had been obtained and what period of time that use had been active at that location.
Okay.
Does that work?
I would just wanted to respond to a couple of things. We've heard some earlier comments. There's the discussion about one accessory dwelling unit, one junior accessory dwelling unit. Why is staff coming up with that calculation? And that's mainly because it's in conjunction with also our recommendation to remove the deed restriction. So what that would do is it would end up having no owner on site. So I just wanted to offer that as a little bit more as to our thinking as to why that recommendation came forth. As you well know, this is an iterative process, and the current iteration is before you. So that's our staff recommendation, but everything you do will be informed by all the information we have to date, all the public comments. So certainly your recommendation could be different than that. I also wanted to clarify Ms. Guinness from Lily Pad Homes. She made a comment about the configuration of parking and how it relates to the addition of a junior accessory dwelling unit. I spoke to her and got a little more clarification on what her position was, and it's that when you add a junior accessory dwelling unit to a home that in its current configuration would say have less parking than is currently required by code, that the addition of that junior dwelling unit shouldn't require the property to become fully compliant. So if you have 3 parking spaces, you need 4. By adding this junior, the city shouldn't be requiring now 4 spaces. That is our position. The staff recommendation would be the addition of a junior accessory dwelling unit shouldn't force a legal non-conforming parking configuration to now become conforming. Her other recommendation was if we do that, then that parking space should be allowed in any configuration or location on site.
Okay, great, thanks. So any other questions before we take up our discussion? Mr. Gage, do you have anything else you want to add? Okay, so I'm going to bring this back to the commission, and I think the best way for us to do this, because there are a lot of moving parts, I'm going to go ahead and ask somebody to move the resolution. We'll be discussing it. But what I want to do is, before we go to full comments, is using the staff report and all of the summaries that Mr. Gage did of the changes, starting with parking, is do just a raise of hands if there's anybody on the, any commissioner that wants to further discuss, potentially change the language. So in other words, I'd call out parking, look at the summary. If there's anybody that wants to further discuss that, potentially to change it. We don't need to be discussing the positives at this point. What I want to get to is what do we need to talk about. And I already know one we're going to be talking about. So does that make sense? Then I'll call setbacks if anybody wants to discuss that. Clearly, there's a number of us that are going to want to discuss the minimum 30-day rental. But just I want to get an idea initially of what we'll be discussing, keeping track of that, and then going back to the points of discussion to see if we'll be making any modifications. And you will, after we do that, if we're making modifications or not, after those discussions of the specifics, I'm going to allow each commissioner to speak in general about how they feel about this particular zoning code text amendment. So, trying to make sure that we do it in a real focused way. That's my plan. So, hopefully it's going to work. Okay, so to start with, could somebody move the resolution?
I'll move a resolution of the Planning Commission of the City of Santa Rosa recommending to City Council approval of an ordinance amending zoning code sections 20-22.030, 20-36.040, 20-42.130, and 20-70.020 to allow for accessory dwelling units and junior accessory dwelling units in compliance with state law and in support of the city's housing action plan, file number REC 17-006, and waive for the reading.
I'll second.
Okay, so that was moved by Commissioner Duggan, seconded by Vice Chair Edmondson. And again, anybody wanting to discuss or change anything about the parking summary? Okay, so we'll be discussing parking. And setbacks. Unit size and bedroom standards. yards. Sounds like we're good with that. Okay. Deed restrictions. Okay. Minimum rental period. Yes. The summary on the utility fees. Permanent foundation. Everybody's okay with that. Discretionary permits, that's for the hillside areas and the preservation districts. Any discussion on that? Okay. Any further discussion on definitions? And then we were given some information about the CHB recommendations from staff. Any discussion about what they're recommending? Okay. Okay, I'm messing up my own plan here. Okay. So let's start with parking, and Vice Chair Edmondson, you want to discuss that?
Thank you. I think that I like the staff's resolution of the parking requirement. It's a reasonable resolution of it to not require new off-street for the J80Us and have one for the ADUs. But I just would hope that maybe there would be some way to have a more flexible provision, because what I hear from practically everyone in the public is the need to reduce costs, especially the costs up front, in any way possible. And even though our purview up here is limited, we can't look at a lot of the fees that the City Council is going to look at. One thing we can do is figure out ways that it can be cheaper to build these things. And one way that it could be cheaper to build these things is to not have a new space that needs to be built. And maybe the existing language is flexible enough to allow for this. But there are single-family residences and other residential uses in the city, believe it or not, where there's overabundance of parking. I know nobody feels that way very often, but there are places like that. Or there are individual parcels where, you know, maybe it's a person who's older and their children are grown and their spouse maybe passed away or is disabled, and they have a 2 or 3 car garage and a driveway, and I would hope that that person wouldn't be required for their ADU to build a new off-street parking space, because it seems like a bit of a waste. So if it were possible to let homeowners who are developing these to provide somehow either in a lease or in a private agreement or an easement to allow for a permanent space that already happens to be constructed, that then could be deducted from the spaces for the primary residence, that would be a basically free way for people to satisfy that requirement, and it wouldn't result in negative impacts on the neighborhood. So that's one way to save a little bit of money, and it might be a little bit intricate to put the language together, but I think it would be a way for people to build these more quickly and to save a few $1,000s. So I'm happy to hear from any of my fellow commissioners or staff about whether that's unrealistic somehow or whether that might be a good recommendation for the City Council.
I'd like to hear from staff about that.
So I may be simplifying what you said, but what I was hearing is a form of reduction of parking requirement for ADUs, and that would be to allow one of the existing on-site or off-street parking spaces that's allocated to single family be allocated to the ADU. So you're not creating any new space, but you're allocating an existing site space for that new ADU.
That's, yeah,
It's
exactly.
kind of a parking reduction for the single family primary unit. But the idea is no new parking spaces for the ADU. That's probably the simplest way to say it.
That is a good way to say it. And you could say it either that you're pooling the required spaces among all the units on the property, or that you are providing for an alternative means of creating the space. You're not putting concrete on the ground, but you're creating an easement or something like that.
So there's a couple options, just thinking out loud. You're either waiving parking requirements for an ADU if there's on-site parking for the property, or you set a threshold for that. So if the single-family dwelling, the primary unit, meets all of its parking requirements, that is then the threshold that waives any additional parking space for that ADU. Does that make sense? So either it's just an outright reduction where you don't have to have a parking space for that ADU, or you set a threshold that's waived. You don't need any additional spaces if, let's say, the parking requirement's 4 spaces for that single family, if that property already has those 4 spaces. If it has 3, then you add the extra unit, the extra parking space.
I think I get the simplest way to do it, although it's not as aggressive. I think I would prefer one where you could reduce the requirement below the otherwise needed single-family requirement, but that might just be a little too complicated. So I think maybe what I would prefer is just an ability to look at the whole parcel as pooled. And so if the single-family is exceeding if it's provided more parking spaces than it was required, then it can give one of those to the accessory dwelling unit.
Yeah, I think I can elaborate a little bit on that. And I think that from what you're describing, if it's not an outright parking reduction for the additional unit, that there's already flexibility in here that would address that. So to restate some language in here, the off-street parking shall be permitted uncovered, compact, tandem, in setback areas, unless their determination is made that it's not feasible. So let me just very briefly talk about the parking requirements for the single-family dwelling. They are 4 spaces with 1 covered, but additionally, they can utilize off-street parking that's immediately adjacent to the lot. So back to your concept of pooling the parking spaces for the single-family residence, if, for example, there's a 1-car garage and 2 parking spaces in the driveway, and there's additional parking on street, certainly we can pool those in total and simply redesignate them, saying that like this space in the garage is for the accessory dwelling and the additional parking necessary for the single-family dwelling is accommodated on street. I think there's sufficient flexibility to allow that already. Am I misunderstanding?
No, not at all. I just wouldn't want there to be doubt as to whether people would need to build a whole new space or dedicate a whole new space. The idea that they can reallocate one of the ones that already exists is just the clarity that I would want. And I understand your interpretation. It just might not be obvious to people who read it. So clarificatory language of some sort.
If I may, it sounds perhaps like maybe there's a desire, maybe the other commissioners will be interested in just waiving a parking requirement for an accessory dwelling unit.
That would be great.
You can do that. And so it goes along with what I said just a moment ago. You know, these recommendations that we've given you, they are our recommendations. They're based on information we have to date, analysis that we've done, looking at other cities, taking public comment, but they really are a starting point. So if the commission is interested in going further or being more conservative in some instances, that's the commission's purview and can certainly do that. So in this instance, if a waiver of parking is the interest of the commission, that can be a recommendation that we forward to the city council.
You want to weigh in on that, Commissioner Duggan?
Yeah, my only thought is a previous item we heard tonight, and the neighbors talking about how much on-street parking is taken up by people who live in the neighborhood. If their houses were large enough and they want to do like a junior unit or if they had a backyard that could accommodate an accessory dwelling unit, where are they going to have that person park? I mean, in some neighborhoods, I think it's totally appropriate and totally fine and wouldn't really be a negative impact. But in a neighborhood like that, it would be.
Well, I was going to suggest kind of a combination of some of the suggestions that have come forward so far. You could provide that no additional parking is required for the ADU, provided that there are blank number of spaces available on site as it is. You could choose that number, or you can, I think, as Mr. Rose was suggesting earlier, you could have some standard that ties it to the number of parking spaces, and the number of bedrooms, or there are a lot of different variations. Again, of course, you're free also to say simply no new parking space is required for an ADU. Since ADUs though can be as large as 1,200 square feet, I would simply keep that in mind as well.
And I'd like to remind the Commission of the pretty broad provisions for exemption parking requirements that are integral to the state regulation. Just to remind the Commission that any accessory dwelling unit, be it the internal conversions, are exempt from parking requirements at the outset. There are the additional exemptions of an accessory dwelling, new, attached, detached, conversion of existing, would be exempt from parking requirements if it's within half a mile of a transit stop. That's a significant portion of the city. And the exemptions for parking requirements in historic districts.
Commissioner, will you have something to say about this?
I just wonder if an option might be to provide some discretion to staff to evaluate how it's coming through, and if it looks reasonable given site conditions to waive, rather than just saying yes or no, or setting a number that might not work for some neighborhoods but would work for others.
Just as a reminder, it's very clear from the state that it's already the provisions of the state, but this ordinance, this new legislation is even, I think, more explicit. There's going to be no discretion surrounding an accessory dwelling unit.
Well, never mind.
Also, there's also community interest to keep this as straightforward and clear and simple as possible, because one obstacle that I'm quite aware of is just lack of understanding all these terms and nuances. So I would stress you can't really be too clear or too simple in your direction.
If I can answer to that, it's less complicated to have no requirement than it is to say, count how far away you are from a mass transit stop, and whether you're in a historic district. So I would be open, if it's a compromise position, to adopt what the city attorney brought up about setting a standard for if there's a certain number of spaces on site, for instance, one available on site, then there's no requirement. But I would prefer that we just have no requirement at all, because it's clearly contemplated in the state law that we can do that. The state law realized that some jurisdictions might want to do that, and because it's the clearest and because it's the cheapest, I would prefer that solution. But I am open to compromise.
Commissioner Weech, do you want to weigh in on this? No. Commissioner Browning? I think it's an interesting suggestion. I think where I'm getting a little squeamish is the fact that we are allowing 1,200 square foot places and 3 bedrooms. It's sort of different than our prior ordinance where it was clear it was maybe going to be one person. So I'm a little squeamish about it. I think the flexibility is built in, and maybe it'd be less squeamish if we just hadn't seen this photograph of all of these cars on this guy's place. But parking is a problem in neighborhoods, and the neighbors, I live in a code enforcement neighborhood. There's just a lot of issues that affect the quality of life, and heavy parking on the street is one of them. So I guess I'd be more inclined to just leave it as is, given that we are creating such large ones, and trust that there are a lot of areas where they would be waived anyway because of the state regulations. But that's just me. We can take it.
Can I make a quick comment?
Sure.
We have, I think, in the draft the requirement that the development of ADUs will not allow parcels to go above their lot coverage requirements. So if we're thinking about a scenario where every square inch of a residential lot is covered by dwelling units, that's not going to be allowed because of lot coverage requirements, is my understanding of it. So we can go up to 1,200 square feet, but in those neighborhoods where there's already significant lot coverage, then even if they could physically fit a 1,200 square foot structure in there, they would exceed the lot coverage requirements. And so there's already a de facto kind of limit, I think, on the sizes of the ADUs in those sort of small lot subdivision type neighborhoods.
Yeah. Well,
if I may, I was also going to offer another option. You could waive parking for ADUs of a certain size, so that if for a smaller unit, if the concern is that some of these units may be in fact a 3-bedroom house, you might decide to waive parking for units under 700 square feet, or units that contain only 1 bedroom. There are options there as well.
What do we think about that?
I think that sounds cleaner. I'd be in favor of that. Like under 700 square feet or under 1 bedroom.
What about you, Commissioner Wendell?
Yeah, I could support that as well, tying it to the affordable by design kind of standard. I think that's a nice solution.
How are you feeling about that?
I would support that. I want the number to be as high as possible. But if it were 700 or 750, or if it were 1 bedroom or a studio, any of those formulas I would support.
So we should be specific, though, and say square footage or 1 bedroom or whatever.
I think square footage works really well because part of our ordinance is not proposing to restrict bedrooms. So we aren't looking at number of bedrooms, and we certainly, the reason why we're not doing that is because that's an obstacle too, so we took that out. So you want to add that back in for just parking. But if square footage would be great and objective and ministerial.
So we would be picking 700? 750?
750 would be wonderful.
Are we okay with that? And you guys are okay with that? Okay. So when we get to it, I think what we can do is propose that as a friendly amendment, since we're all in agreement with that. Okay, setbacks. Commissioner Duggan, what's your issue about setbacks?
Yeah, I'm fine with all the ones that are written in the staff report, but I know that there was a letter, and it started me thinking on the comments in the letter saying that even depending on how your lot is structured and how your neighbor's lots are structured, there can be a condition where you can have a legal accessory dwelling unit that's much closer to the neighboring house than it is to the main house on the main property. And is there any mechanism we can put in, like defined in the setbacks, that doesn't happen, because that could be more of an impact on the neighbors than on the homeowner?
I think I do understand. I will note that the state regulation is explicit that existing structures such as garages that exist on property lines would be exempt from any setback requirement, and they would be converted in place. That said, we did write into the provision of the ordinance that for single-story accessory dwellings that they would receive the same setbacks as a regular accessory structure in a residential zone. There's actual language in there previously, and it's being retained, if I recall correctly, that the distance between the accessory structure and any adjacent residence be no less than 10 feet, which is consistent with the side setbacks between single-family residences currently. Does that address those concerns?
Not totally. I mean, I can see, like, if you had a deep rectangular lot and you wanted to put a house on the back corner and or accessory dwelling unit on the back corner, and your neighbors are close to that part of your lot, then you could have a huge separation from the main house and the ADU, but not from the neighboring houses.
So the proposal does not include currently a provision requiring the distance between the residence and the accessory structure to be less than the distance between the accessory structure, accessory unit and adjacent residences to be less than or equal to that distance. And I think it's problematic because there are provisions of the state law that allow for a unit on the property line to be converted in place from an accessory structure to a unit. So I'm concerned that there's potential conflict between a proposal like that and the state regulation as it's written.
Okay. I mean, that's fine. If that's, I don't want to preclude the state law, so that's fine.
Okay. And anybody else wanting to discuss setbacks? Okay. I want Mr. Rummel to be here because I know he wants to talk about the minimum rental period. Here he comes. Good. Just in time. Okay, so we're moving on to discuss issues with the minimum rental period, and now I'm going to let you go for it, Commissioner Rummel. You can say whatever you want to about that.
Well, I don't think my powder's dry anymore. Well, I already made the point. I think that if we're intending to regulate VRBOs, we should do that directly rather than trying to put it into this policy. And having said that, even I just don't agree. Because it seems like a complete prohibition on VRBOs in the city. We live in the same neighborhood. My next door neighbor operates a VRBO. And I appreciate the statement that, those are essentially be grandfathered in, existing ones. But particularly for somebody who lives on the property, and I know that's yet another change, to be able to rent out an accessory dwelling unit, they're on site, they can, curb behavior if it gets inappropriate. And I fundamentally just think that somebody should be able to rent out their accessory dwelling unit should they want. It's their property, and it's not otherwise being used illegally. So I really, really would like to not see this restriction in our recommendation that goes forward to the council. And if we want to put language in there that says something to the I don't know. I'm open for a discussion about how to get to some form of the interest or the spirit behind this, but I just can't support a 30-day threshold for barring renting that unit out.
Commissioner Duggan, you have anything to say?
I'm in agreement with that. I don't like the notion that there are some that are in use now that could be grandfathered in, and then somebody else who just happens to come down later and build their own accessory dwelling unit can't rent it as a vacation rental. I also think if it is a problem, the city identifies that they want to have a citywide ordinance. How is it going to work if they decide that the minimum rental period is 2 weeks, say, instead of 30 days? And would that apply retroactively to the accessory dwelling units if it came down with a different time frame than what we have in our in this proposed ordinance?
Vice Chair Edmondson, you have anything to say?
Sure. I support the draft as written with the 30-day requirement, and the reason why is because I think that the purpose of this ordinance and the purpose of the state law is to provide affordable housing for people. And if we, I understand that it would be nice to allow people to have the short-term rental as an option for an income stream, but the 30 long-term rentals, month-to-months or annual rentals, is an income stream as well. Maybe it's not quite as lucrative, but I don't think that the goal of the legislation is necessarily to provide for a new type of investment for people who own homes. It's to create affordable housing that people can live in. And that might be why it's distinct and why it should be treated in this ordinance, is because limiting vacation rentals of 5-bedroom mansions to, with pools, that might not carry the same considerations as limiting vacation rentals to 800 square foot accessory dwelling units. So I don't think that it's quite in keeping with what the goal of the state law and what the needs of Santa Rosa are to make any kind of provision in this law that would create less affordable housing, and I think that's what the effect of that would be.
Commissioner Rowling, you have something to say?
I would just say that I concur with Commissioner Edmondson on this, that as I understand the whole focus, which I clearly support, is that we've got a housing crisis here. The intent should be to address that now. And so I think the 30-day rule should stay.
Commissioner Weeks, what do you think?
Well, I would like to see it longer than 30 days because I also think that if we are going to address the housing crisis, as you said, and provide affordable housing, it should be longer. But I know I'm probably in the minority, so I'll go with 30 days.
Okay, yeah, I'm very much in disagreement with this rental period, but I don't think we're going to get very far with it. I agree with Commissioner Rumble. I don't think this is the place to try to deal with the Airbnb or the vacation rental issue. I understand the meaning of what the state's trying to accomplish in terms of making more affordable housing. But what I see in putting this forward is there's no real enforcement agency. It's complaint driven. That leaves it to our code enforcement department to deal with those types of complaints if it's violated. I don't like the fact that there are already pre-existing Airbnbs and what the impact of this is going to do on them. I think it just opens up a bunch of legal can of worms, and I don't think that, while the spirit is there to make sure, yeah, let's get the affordable housing, I don't think this particular provision, I don't think it's going to prevent that, and I just think it just opens up a bunch of problems for the city that could be expensive. And I guess I just see it as trying to solve a problem that doesn't even exist yet. So anyway, but it doesn't look like we're going to get very far with changing it.
If I may just add a point, I completely agree that there's a spirit and intent for creating more affordable housing. I think we have some more work to do, particularly on fees, when we get there, to make that a practical reality. I do think, though, that if I'm trying to operationalize all of this, right, on a day-to-day, how would this work? How would it work for my neighbor? How would it work for me? How would it work for somebody around the block? And if my interest is to build a unit or buy a home to explicitly to rent it out, I'm probably going to figure out a way to do that. If I'm interested in building a unit to create affordable housing, I'm going to do that regardless of what kind of restriction is in place. In other words, I don't think that if I'm converting my garage to be able to give my, teenage daughter who's going to go to the JC a place to live and sort of start to become more independent, or if I'm going to bring in my mother because she's sick and needs care, then that's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to, and that creates affordable housing. I'm not going to rent it out to the street, to VRBO permanently because it makes me another $400 a month, right? So it kind of follows the intent. So to say, well, accessory dwelling units is intended to be a boost to affordable housing and affordable housing only, I think we're kind of fooling ourselves because that's just not the way that the market's really going to work. And people who wanted to use this vehicle as affordable housing will do it, whether or not there's a restriction. So, I mean, that might not be a convincing argument, but I think we're being a little bit Pollyannish to say, we're going to curb vacation rentals because we're going to put a restriction on this other thing with the intent, because there's a spirit of affordable housing behind it. Why not just regulate vacation rentals if that's what we want to do, rather than trying to create a policy on a separate intended policy?
Yeah, and I just will finish up too. I agree with that. I think that, these were originally called granny units, and you are choosing to live in very close proximity when you build one of these to whoever occupies that space. And originally the intention was like with Miss Doherty, it's sort of like you want your family close by, place where you can be looked after, or, your teenage kid can have a private space but be close by. So I guess I see this concern that suddenly everyone's going to build an Airbnb and we're not going to get the kind of housing for family members, affordable housing, etc., is unrealistic. I'm a landlord. I have units on my property. I'm very happy to have people that I know really, really well because they're on my property. They're right there. And to develop an Airbnb is a job. It's like, maybe it sounds good, but when you have that much transition, you are working hard for whatever extra money you get. And I don't see our ADU ordinance as the best vehicle, again, to deal with whatever issues we think may come down the pike with Airbnbs. But we're not getting very far with taking this language out, so anybody else want to say anything, and we'll move on? Okay.
Chair Cisco?
Yes.
Just quickly, if there is no specific direction or there's a deadlock or a split vote, then I think what staff would recommend is we would take our recommendation forward. That recommendation was based on our interest in applying the Housing Action Plan to get more affordable housing. But I think it's important to note all of the sentiments here will be clearly summarized. We'll certainly let the council know that it was a point of concern, and we'll certainly express the opposing viewpoints as well.
Great, thank you. Sure.
One final point on that. I think what could ameliorate some of this is, and I know we've apparently have gone back and forth about it, but if the owner is on site, I think that addresses a lot of the concern about whether or not the ADU is going to be used appropriately, because you have that immediacy. It's also far more likely to be a long-term permanent resident if the owner is on site, I think, because they don't want, to have somebody new in their backyard or in their garage every, 5 days. anecdotal and perception. I don't have any data to support that, but it could be one of the sentiments that's tossed back to or included in the staff report back to council.
I was going to mention that this proposal is, like somebody else had said, is all integrated. So we try to think about this comprehensively, and this is the idea of having this limit was in conjunction with not having a deed restriction. But there's other jurisdictions, the county, including Sonoma County, they have this restriction. But if you do have a vacation rental, that's when they have the deed restriction for owner-occupied. So that's also something that you can consider, is that these aren't absolutes, but it could be conditional. So if they do become a vacation rental, then you kick in the deed restriction for owner-occupancy. But if it's used as an ADU, you have the freedom to not do that. There's enforcement issues with all that, but that's the approach that they took. And those two things could be thought of in conjunction. And they will, and ultimately the city will probably have to take on vacation rentals. We're just looking at ADUs. The state gives us an opportunity to weigh in. We're weighing in. But ultimately it's a bit broader issue for primary units, as was noted. So.
Okay. Utility fees. Commissioner Romo, you had something you wanted to say about utility fees.
Well, I think if we're really going to address affordability, this is where we do it, affordable housing, rather than on rental restrictions. So, I mean, I'm trying to work through, again, sort of operationally how it works, and I think that I heard a little bit of an ease of my concern about water, but I wasn't positive about it. So if I'm converting my garage, again, just to use that example, for my mother or for my daughter who's moving from the house to the garage, not really increasing any water use or sewer use, I don't think that I should have to pay a fee or have another meter on that. So I wasn't quite clear if I understood that correctly. I did. Okay, so that eases my concern a great deal. Having said that, I do want to make sure that this isn't a barrier for the affordable side. So if there's any way that we can decrease, waive, eliminate a fee, maybe it's going back to that square footage affordable by design standard that we had for parking. I really appreciate that approach. Being true to that concept of affordability, and to say, well, maybe it is the 25%. I think I heard Sebastopol doing, or maybe it's a waived or something along those lines. I don't know that I've got the solution, but I don't want full fees placed on ADUs. I get that JDUs are separate, JADUs. So anyway, that's my comment. Again, I don't know if I've got the answer, but this is the biggest area, the biggest barrier that I see to actually accomplishing the spirit of the policy.
And again, that's going to be taken up at council, so we can, they'll note our comments, but yeah, okay. Nothing we can do about it right now. Okay. So I don't have anything else that we were to discuss. What it looks like to me is we have the resolution moved with the staff recommendations, with the exception of a potential friendly amendment waiving parking requirements for units smaller than 750 square feet. And I think, Commissioner Duggan, did you make the...
I did, but can we make any additional comments we might have?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Can we make any additional comments we might have?
Oh, gosh, see you.
It's late, I know.
Yes, thank you for reminding me. It's 9 o'clock. I was getting too excited here. Okay, Commissioner Rumble, would you like to make comments in general about the ordinance? Okay.
Yeah, I just want to second Commissioner Rumble's comments on utility fees, and also just fees in general. Anything we can do to lower the fees in general, including the building permitting and impact fees and all that. I think that's going to go a long way to help people build these. I'm also totally in can't think of the word. I would love to see that we had a set of pre-approved plans that had associated building permit fees attached to them, so people could come in and go, I'm building a 700 square foot unit, and here's a pre-approved plan that I don't have to go out and hire my own architect. I know cities like Santa Cruz have that already in place, and I think it would be fabulous if we did too. And I think that's about all.
Okay, Vice Chair Edmondson.
Okay, I'll try to make this really as fast as possible. I got a few of my pet issues that I brought up earlier, but I understand that the CC&R issue needs legal research. So I think that, the answer could go either way. Maybe we can't do it, maybe we can do it. So a word that could cover us either way would be to say maybe instead of, it's not the intent of this ordinance to override lawful use restrictions, maybe it's not the intent to override existing lawful use restrictions. So if it's not within the city's power to override restrictions, then that sentence will mean the same thing, whether the word existing is in it or not. But if it is within the city's power to override future CCRs, then the word existing would allow the city to do that. So I would bring that up as a suggestion for a friendly amendment, and I think it's in two different sections, one for accessory and one for junior. Quickly, maybe just clarificatory language on the number of units allowed that reflect that the JADUs and the ADUs are counted separately. I would have to look at it here to think of a specific way to express it. Okay, here's what it says. A maximum of one accessory dwelling unit and maybe add and one junior accessory dwelling unit shall be permitted on any lot. That way, people like me who might not read it the right way the first time would read it more accurately. And then this is something that maybe is beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about here because we've already run so long, but the draft resolution has an architecture requirement. It's number 5 under that same section. It's on page 5 of our draft, between lot coverage and privacy. And the new units are required to incorporate the same or substantially similar architectural features, building materials, and colors as the main dwelling. That seems like it could be expensive maybe for people. I understand that you don't want to let wildly incompatible looking buildings necessarily be in the same neighborhood, but especially since so many of these ADUs might be invisible from the street, if a looser standard for that could be provided instead of same or substantially similar, maybe the word compatible architectural features, building materials. So I'm sorry to drop the menu on everyone there, but I just had a bunch of thoughts that weren't in any of the headings in the staff report. So,
if I may, with respect to the term compatible, having sat with the Design Review and Cultural Heritage Board as they've reviewed projects, it's pretty clear to me that the determination of what is compatible entails a lot of discretion, and I have concerns that would be, adding the term compatible would be inconsistent with state law.
That's a good observation, so I'll drop that. So I'll just leave the CC&R suggestion and the clarification on the counting of units, friendly amendments, and if it's beyond the scope of what we can talk about here, if that could be included for City Council, but if it could be quickly amended in a friendly way, that would be fine too.
So could you tell us what the impact would be of changing that word to existing for the CC&Rs? I'm not even sure what page were you on when you were looking at that.
It's on 2 different pages. It's on page 1, and then it's again in the first paragraph of the JADU, same sentence. which would be on page, I believe, 7.
Okay, I'm confused. Do you know what?
Did you? I wasn't sure if you were asking me to address that.
I was asking you to address that before we put it into any kind of a friendly amendment. I want to understand. I mean, he's asking for sort of legalese clarifications. I want to make sure that you are in line with that before we chose to decide on it.
Yes, my understanding of the intent of adding existing is that any CCNRs that currently exist as of the date of this ordinance, and we might want to clarify that, would not be affected by this ordinance, but it would leave open the possibility that the city might preclude prohibitions on accessory dwelling units in future CCNRs. As I mentioned earlier, I have concerns about whether the city would have authority to do that. But I have not researched it in particular. So if that is something that the commission would like to see in the ordinance, we can certainly take that to council, and between tonight and the time the council meets, I would do that research and have a clear answer for the city council. Unfortunately, I don't have a clear answer tonight, although I do express my doubts that the city has authority. But again, I don't know.
I think that, sorry to jump in there, but I think that makes sense then, given the posture of the research, to just recommend it to City Council if your research, or mention that it was broached to City Council if your research reveals that might be legal.
Yes, we can word it that way, that the commission recommends that revision if the research indicates that it is legally permissible to do so.
And sorry to continue on, but if we have any language for clarifying that the count of units is cumulative, I haven't thought of any sitting here that would be ideal, or maybe I did when I brought it up a few minutes ago, but would anybody on the commission object to a change in that language about the counting of the number of units between a JADU and an ADU?
No, actually, I think that would be helpful, because I didn't realize that we could have one of each, and I was very happy to hear that. So we could add that as a suggestion, a friendly amendment. So leave it to your choice as to how to do that.
And if I may just add one consideration. So Vice Chair Edmondson was referring to the materials, the architectural style, an interest in maybe allowing the accessory dwelling unit to have a different material or architectural style. Just for the Commission's reference, visibility from the street is a threshold criteria that is utilized in the zoning code. So for an example, projects that are within preservation districts that would trigger a landmark alteration permit, the distinction between a minor and a major, one of the threshold criteria is visibility from the street. So you're visible from the street, you go to the major permit. So I just wanted to give that as an option. If that's an interest of the Commission, that could be a threshold that is implemented in the ADU, JADU ordinance. If it's not visible from the street, it could have a different type of architectural style and material.
I would support that, because I think it would provide more flexibility for people if they find a design that is cost effective for them, that is perfectly of high design quality, but might not be exactly the same as their current structure. I think that would be nice to not stop anybody from building if it's invisible from the street to begin with.
I think that's a good suggestion, because there's this whole tiny home movement. They're modular, they're already built, and so I think that gives room for something like that to be put in place. Okay. Okay. So do you have any other comments you want to make?
That's it, thanks.
If I can keep track of this, I'm starting to lose it here. Commissioner Brown, would you like to say something generally about this ordinance?
For a number of reasons, I'm finding myself more generalizing on this particular item tonight, but I want to re-emphasize a couple of points that have been made here. And it seems to me, first of all, that whatever we can do to incentivize and create flexibility with the end goal of assisting and increasing low-cost housing opportunities in this community is vitally important. And following along those lines, I would really concur in terms of every way we can to reduce those utility fees, because that becomes a driving matter here in terms of cost. Give it the individual who wishes to get family in to perhaps help as they assist a family member who's a property owner in declining years or ill health, whatever. We should do everything to assist folks those lines. Another thing that was brought up, I believe, by Commissioner Duggan is this whole matter of conflicting setbacks, possibly. And it's hard to address straight up, probably, because of the differing lot sizes and configurations of lots. But I would ask that further consideration be given to that. How you formulate that, I don't know, but I tend to concur with what Commissioner Duggan was talking about in terms of you can find yourself, in essence, inadvertently putting into an ADU unit that, in essence, may, well, just will create both sides of the fence, perhaps, a setback issue that was unintended. That's all I'm saying there. Utilities, I happen to think that Airbnbs should be addressed someplace else, but I won't give any more information on that. And then going to the district, and some of these waivers, we're in essence kind of talking about, be it parking or whatever, but maybe we may, and I'm thinking of the historic districts, obviously, but we may need to take a look at some things, district by district or setting by setting. I tend to, I'm a bit confused by what the Cultural Heritage Board was proposing. All I would say is I'd add consistency and compatibility same way, and you can deal with both. Again, remembering, as Mr. Rose indicated, is that you're looking at in the historic districts, the driving issue is line of sight, whatever, in terms of you're looking at historic, say, modifications, whatever they may be, that are proposed in a historic district. The threshold really is what it looks like to the street, in essence. And I think you can be consistent and compatible by allowing modifications, yet they've got to be consistent and compatible with what the historic district's about. That's all.
Commissioner Weeks? Okay. Yeah, I would just say I'm pleased to see this going forward. I'm really impressed with the community input. I mean, clearly these meetings were really well attended. There's a lot of interest in Santa Rosa in moving these things forward, and I'm happy to see it. And you know, there was a time on the commission, we don't do that anymore, but we used to sort of see tentative map developments come forward, and we would insist the developer add some second dwelling units into it, and we can't do that anymore. But I hope that as this goes forward, particularly as the fees get addressed, that we do see, not only individual homeowners adding units, but that we also see these as part of larger developments included. And so I've said all I can say about the 30-day Airbnb thing. I really do feel strongly that it's not enforceable in any way. It's just going to be a big, expensive legal conundrum, and it will be frustrating for those that want to see it enforced if that's what happens. But I really don't think it's as big an issue as maybe the state thinks it is, or we do here. So, but with that, I think we are ready to go. So we have a couple of friendly amendments proposed for Commissioners Duggan and Rumble to approve. That is waiving the parking requirement for smaller units under 700 square feet, adding clarifying language for the unit counts, and that an amendment to number 5 on architectural compatibility, that if it can't be seen from the street, it doesn't necessarily have to be similar to the building materials. So, you guys okay with that?
Yes, I'm okay with all three.
And you, did you second it? Yeah, you seconded it. I'm sorry. My page is not in front of me right now. I think you did second it.
I'm fine with it. I would like 750 though for the parking.
Didn't I say 750?
Oh, did you? Okay, then if you did, I'm perfectly fine with that.
I have it written down as 750. I might not have said it.
It's so late that I can't hear anymore.
I know, it's so late I can't read it. So, okay.
I am fine with it.
Okay, good. So then we have that moved by Commissioner Duggan, seconded by Vice Chair Edmondson, with those friendly amendments in place. Hopefully that correlates with what you guys have. Okay, your votes, please. And that passes with 6 ayes. And that concludes tonight's meeting. Thanks for hanging in there with us. It's a long night. Thank you.